My neighbor died, and I blame myself for his death. It was just a regular afternoon. I had just returned from the grocery store, my son waiting for me outside to help unload the bags. We were doing what we always did, chatting about mundane things and preparing to go inside when suddenly we heard it. A scream that stopped us both in our tracks. I'm not talking about a casual shout or a child's cry. This was primal, a sound so raw, so filled with terror and pain that it sent chills down my spine. It sounded like an adult woman, and the terror in her voice was unmistakable. It was the kind of scream you never want to hear in your life. The kind that makes you realize something awful is happening right now, and you're not ready to face it. We started scanning the neighborhood, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound was so piercing, so desperate, that it seemed to echo off the walls of every house nearby. Then, we saw it. The house across the street and one over. We'd never met them before. They were just another family in a row of families you nod to occasionally, maybe wave at when you're both putting out the trash. The scream stopped for a moment, and then, a second later, started again. This time it was even worse, more guttural, more frantic. My son and I exchanged a look. We knew something was horribly wrong. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we watched the garage door of that house start to open. Just a crack, and then close again. It opened and closed a few more times, each time as if someone inside was trying to escape. I could feel the panic rising inside me. What were we supposed to do? We didn't know these people. But the screams, the terror. Someone needed help. A neighbor from the house next door was outside now, too. He looked as confused and worried as we did. The three of us, strangers brought together by this horrifying situation, cautiously approached the driveway. None of us spoke at first, just glancing at each other, sharing the same silent fear. We all knew something was seriously wrong, but we didn't know what to do. The screaming continued, and the garage door opened and closed again. We had no choice but to call the police. As soon as we agreed, I pulled out my phone to dial 911, but just as I started to explain what was happening, the garage door finally opened all the way. A woman ran out, wild-eyed, her face pale and tear-streaked. Her hair was a mess, clothes disheveled. She was gasping for breath, screaming something incomprehensible at first. Then, through her sobs, we understood. "My son is dead," she wailed. "I found him. He's dead. I haven't seen him all day, and he's dead." She was pacing, her hands shaking, her breath ragged. It was the kind of panic that consumes a person. She was lost in her own grief, in the horror of what she had just discovered. Without thinking, I rushed to her and grabbed her by the shoulders. She was so close to collapsing from the sheer weight of it all. I had to make her focus. "How old is he?" I asked, my voice trembling. 26, she managed to choke out before breaking down again. I froze. 26? This wasn't a child. This wasn't someone I could try to save with CPR. This was a grown man, her son, and she had found him dead, just now, in his room. I felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't ready to walk into that house and face what she had just seen. I couldn't. All I could do was hold her, trying to keep her from crumbling. I grabbed my phone again, called 911, and explained the situation in a shaky voice. As I waited for help to arrive, I rocked her back and forth, trying to calm her, though I knew my words were probably just background noise to her agony. She was hyperventilating, barely able to stay on her feet. I had to take her face in my hands a few times to get her to look at me, to keep her from spiraling into unconsciousness. I didn't know what else to do. My son was standing just 10 feet away, his eyes wide, trying to process everything. I couldn't even think about him in that moment. I just had to keep her from collapsing completely. The paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. I explained everything to them as best as I could, still holding on to the woman as if my touch alone could keep her from breaking. They nodded, calm, professional, and went inside the house. They were so composed, so used to this kind of tragedy. It was routine for them. For us, for her, it was the worst day of her life. When they came back out, one of the paramedics walked over to the police and told them, softly, that the son had been dead for some time. There was nothing they could do. I felt the woman in my arms stiffen, and then the screams started all over again. This time, they were worse, louder, more guttural, more animalistic. The kind of scream you can't forget. Paramedics mentioned something to the officers about a fentanyl patch on his arm. I heard it clearly, and my heart sank even deeper. I'm a recovering opiate addict. I'd been clean for years, but hearing that word fentanyl hit me like a punch to the gut. It brought back memories of how close I had come so many times to losing everything. And now, this young man, this stranger, was gone because of it. As the reality of the situation settled over me, I started to remember all the times I had been annoyed by that neighbor kid. The late-night basketball games, the thumping bass from his car when he and his friends hung out outside. And now he was dead, and his mother was in my arms, her world shattered. Paramedics were all men, and they were doing their jobs, but I knew they wouldn't hold her the way I was holding her. They wouldn't offer her the kind of comfort she needed in that moment. I stayed with her, even though I didn't know her, even though this wasn't my tragedy. I couldn't leave her until someone she knew arrived. Her breathing was still labored, and the paramedics eventually laid her down in the ambulance and sedated her. As they drove away, I stood there, numb, filled with adrenaline and grief. I've always felt things deeply, and this was no different. In moments like this, it's hard to separate yourself from the pain of others. It felt like I had been pulled into her world, into her suffering. I walked back to the end of the driveway where my son was waiting for me. His face was pale, his eyes full of a heaviness that didn't belong to someone his age. He turned to me and said, "All those times I told you I wanted to die. I'll never do that to you." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and thanked him, though my mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. We walked home in silence. For years, I had worried about my own son, terrified of what I might find behind his door. He had told me so many times how he didn't feel attached to this life, how he was too decent, too sensitive for this world. And I had lived in constant fear, never knowing what the next day would bring. Putting away the groceries felt wrong after what we had just witnessed. Felt like we were betraying the gravity of what had just happened. But we didn't know what else to do. The ambulance was still outside, and the stunned silence hung over our house for the rest of the evening. Following days were a blur. I saw the cars parked down the street for the funeral service, and I thought about leaving a card in their mailbox. But I didn't. Our houses were far enough apart that we never ran into each other, and they moved away a few months later. That was 5 years ago. My son is still here, keeping his promise. But that day, that scream, that moment, it changed everything. I'll never forget it.
My kids knew about my wife's affair and helped her cover it up. Last week, everything in my life shattered in a moment. After 29 years of marriage, I found out that the woman I thought I knew better than anyone had been deceiving me. But that wasn't even the worst part. The part that broke me to my core was that my daughters, my own flesh and blood, were helping her cover it up. It started on an ordinary afternoon. My wife, Linda, was in the shower, and I was sitting on the couch, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone. A notification lit up on her phone beside me. I didn't think much of it. With our 2 daughters, Maddie and Alice, living nearby, Linda was often in touch with them. I assumed it was one of them confirming their plans for dinner that evening, something they'd been doing regularly for a few months. It was a simple tradition, just the 3 of them going out for a girls' night. No big deal. But then I saw it. A text from an unsaved number popped up on the screen. "I can't wait to see you tonight." My stomach dropped. The lighthearted message didn't seem like something you'd send to a casual friend or one of our daughters. My hands started to tremble as I opened the conversation. It was brief, mostly plans confirming dinner for that night, and then a few lines about how they missed each other and how once a week wasn't enough. The language was intimate. Too intimate. My head spun as I realized what I was seeing. My wife, the woman I had spent nearly 3 decades with, was having an affair. It was as if the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling, spiraling into disbelief and confusion. But my initial shock quickly gave way to anger. Anger that this was happening. She had betrayed me. And even more, I wanted to catch her in the lie. I needed to know for sure. I grabbed my phone and quickly sent a text to both Maddie and Alice, asking them about their girls' dinner. If Linda had lied to me, then maybe my daughters were part of this lie. It was a ridiculous thought. Why would they lie? They wouldn't. They couldn't. I convinced myself that this was just a misunderstanding. Moments later, my phone buzzed with responses from both Maddie and Alice, excitedly confirming the dinner and saying how much they were looking forward to it. My heart stopped. They were lying too. Why? How could they? It felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Everything I thought I knew about my family, my daughters, my wife, was unraveling. I sat there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. I wasn't proud of what I did after. I turned on the location sharing feature on Linda's phone without her knowing. I wasn't thinking straight. I was fueled by a mixture of rage, hurt, and disbelief. I watched as her little location dot moved across the city, heading toward a restaurant downtown. Still holding on to the hope that I was wrong, that maybe Maddie and Alice were at the restaurant waiting for her, I got into my car and followed her. When I arrived at the restaurant, I felt sick. There she was, sitting at a table near the window, laughing and talking, but not with our daughters. She was with him, her boss, a man I knew from her work functions, someone who I had never imagined would be part of this nightmare. They were holding hands across the table, leaning in close, sharing what looked like an intimate moment. I stood there for a minute, rooted in place, watching the woman I had loved for 29 years betray me in front of my own eyes. I wanted to storm in there, to scream at them, to demand an explanation. But I didn't. Instead, I took out my phone, snapped a few photos of them, and opened the family group chat. My hands shook as I typed the message. Glad you're enjoying girls' dinner together. I hit send and turned off my phone. I couldn't bear to deal with the fallout right then. I drove to my brother's house, where I collapsed on his couch, unable to speak. I spent the night tossing and turning, my mind racing with a million thoughts. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't I noticed? How could she do this? How could they do this? The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and messages. My phone buzzed with over 40 texts and 20 voicemails. My wife's texts followed a predictable pattern, the cheater's playbook of excuses. She apologized profusely, begged for my forgiveness, and swore it was just a mistake. She even tried blaming me in a few of the messages, as if my lack of attention had driven her to this. But I didn't care to hear her excuses. Pictures of her with him were all the proof I needed. I was ready to text her back with a single sentence. I'll be getting a divorce. I suggest you find a lawyer. But my brother stopped me. He's always been the more level-headed one. He told me to take my time, meet with lawyers first, make sure I had the upper hand before making any rash decisions. So I spent the day visiting the top divorce attorneys in town, making sure she couldn't use them against me. By the time I finished, I was emotionally drained, but felt slightly more in control. That was until I checked the messages from my daughters. Both of them had sent long apologetic texts. Maddie, my younger daughter, was frantic. She had sent me almost 50 messages in a panic, saying how much she regretted lying to me, how she hated keeping the secret, how she had been torn between her mother and me. Her boyfriend even texted, begging me to reach out to her because she was on the verge of a breakdown. Maddie, I love you, but you need to understand that what you've done has hurt me deeply. I need space, I replied. She responded almost instantly. Okay, I'm so sorry, Dad. I'll never forgive myself. I love you. But I couldn't bring myself to reply. Alice was different. She was always closer to her mom. Her message wasn't as panicked as Maddie's. She said she was sorry, but then had the nerve to tell me not to throw away a good marriage over one mistake. One mistake? I couldn't believe what I was reading. My entire life had been turned upside down, and she thought it was just a mistake? Alice, this isn't a mistake. This is a betrayal from my entire family. Please don't contact me until I reach out first. I replied, my anger boiling over. She never responded, but later that day, I got another text from Linda. She had seen my message to Alice and started pleading with me not to take my anger out on her. But I couldn't care less about what she thought. As far as I was concerned, the only communication we would have moving forward would be through lawyers. It's been 5 days now, and I'm still staying at my brother's place. Every morning I wake up feeling like I've been hit by a truck. Cry more than I ever have in my life. The sadness is so overwhelming at times it feels like I can't breathe. But then, just as quickly, the anger takes over, and I feel like I could tear the world apart with my bare hands. I don't know how to move forward. I don't know how I'll ever be able to look at my daughters again, let alone my wife. Betrayal runs so deep. Alice is supposed to get married this fall, and I've paid for almost everything, but now I'm not even sure I'll attend. How can I stand there watching her, knowing that she sided with her mother, helped her lie to me? I'm destroyed, completely and utterly destroyed, and I don't know how to pick up the pieces. The days following my discovery turned into a blur. I stayed at my brother's house, avoiding the outside world as much as I could. Every time my phone buzzed, it felt like a reminder that my life was unraveling, and I had no control over it. On the 6th day, the silence at my brother's place started to gnaw at me. He had work, a family of his own to take care of, and as much as he tried to support me, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. So, I did what felt inevitable. I drove back home. The entire drive, I felt like I was heading toward a battlefield. The place that had once been my refuge, my home, now felt tainted, like an enemy stronghold. My heart pounded as I pulled into the driveway. I could see Linda's car parked there, which meant she was inside. I didn't want to talk to her. Didn't want to confront her emotions again. I just wanted to collect some things and go back to my brother's, maybe even check into a hotel. Anything to avoid the confrontation that was surely coming. I unlocked the door quietly, hoping to slip in unnoticed. The house felt eerily still. Too still. For a moment, I wondered if she had left. Maybe she'd run off to stay with her boss, with the man who had stolen everything from me. But then, I heard the faint sound of crying. I froze in place. The sound was coming from the living room. Slowly, I walked toward the door, already bracing myself for whatever would come next. I wasn't sure I had the emotional strength to deal with this, not after everything that had happened. But it wasn't Linda. It was Maddie. She was curled up on the couch, her face buried in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. When she heard my footsteps, she looked up, her tear-streaked face a mix of relief and guilt. "Dad," she croaked, her voice breaking. The word family hung in the air like a cruel joke. What family? The one that had conspired behind my back? The one that was built on lies and betrayal? I sat down across from her, rubbing my temples as the weight of everything pressed down on me. "Maddie, I don't know how we're supposed to move forward from this. I don't know how I'm supposed to trust anyone again, not after this." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Dad, please, I love you. I love you so much. I was stupid. I thought I was protecting you, or maybe protecting Mom. I don't even know anymore. But I swear, I hated every second of it. I never wanted to lie to you. I didn't know what to do." Her words, as heartfelt as they were, didn't fix anything. They didn't erase the pain. But looking at her, so broken and guilt-ridden, I couldn't help but soften, even just a little. She was my daughter. She had made a terrible mistake, but she was still my daughter. "I need time, Maddie," I said, a voice quieter now. "I don't know if I can forgive this, at least not right away. You have to understand that." She nodded, tears streaming down her face again. "I understand, Dad. I do. Please, don't shut me out. I don't know what I'd do if I lost you." I stood up, feeling the walls of the house closing in on me. "I need some space," I muttered, heading for the door. Couldn't be in that house any longer. The memories, the lies, it was all too much. Maddie didn't try to stop me, but as I turned to leave, she called out, "Dad, I'm sorry. I love you." I didn't reply. Couldn't. I just walked out the door and into the fading daylight. That night, I booked a hotel room. I needed distance, needed to clear my head. The time away from the house gave me space to think, process everything. But the anger and hurt didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. I spent hours lying in the dark, replaying everything over and over in my mind. The next morning, I received a text from Alice. It was brief, cold, almost businesslike. "We need to talk, Dad." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. Talking to Alice was the last thing I wanted to do. Unlike Maddie, who had shown some level of remorse, Alice had sided with her mother from the beginning. Her loyalty to Linda, even in the face of betrayal, cut me deeply. I didn't know if I could handle another confrontation, but something about the tone of her message made me pause. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even an explanation. It was just, A demand. We need to talk. As if she had something important to say, something I needed to hear. Reluctantly, I agreed to meet her. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop, a neutral place where emotions wouldn't be as likely to spiral out of control. I wasn't sure I could face her in the house again. That place had become a minefield of broken trust. When I arrived, Alice was already seated at a corner table, her arms crossed and her face unreadable. She had always been the more composed of my two daughters, the one who kept her emotions in check. But today, there was a tension in her posture that I hadn't seen before. I sat down across from her, the silence between us heavy. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice steady but distant. "I almost didn't," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. He didn't flinch. "I know you're angry, Dad. And I get it, I do. But there's something you need to understand." I waited, unsure of what she was about to say. "I know you think I've been siding with Mom through all of this," she began, her gaze hardening. "But it's not that simple. This whole situation, it's more complicated than you realize." "Complicated?" I scoffed. "Alice, your mother had an affair. You both lied to me. What's complicated about that?" She took a deep breath, as if steadying herself for what was coming next. "It wasn't just about the affair, Dad. There were things going on that you didn't see. Things that have been building up for a long time." Her words caught me off guard. What was she talking about? Alice leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Mom's been unhappy for years. She didn't want to say anything because she didn't want to hurt you, but things haven't been right between you two for a long time. You just didn't notice." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Please subscribe to the channel